September 1944, Lorraine, eastern France. If you stood on the ridgelines at first light, you could smell it before you saw it: wet earth, exhaust, cordite hanging in the cool air like a warning. The Americans had been pushing hard for weeks, moving fast enough that maps couldn't keep up. Town names blurred into one another. Bridges, crossroads, supply dumps, everything became a race against time. And time was the one thing the Germans were desperate to steal back. They didn't need to win the war in a day. They didn't even need to crush Patton's army outright. They needed something smaller, sharper, more realistic. They needed to stop the momentum. A counterattack isn't always about glory. Sometimes it's about forcing a pause, cutting a road, breaking a fuel line, turning a confident advance into a cautious crawl. In September 1944, the German command still had enough armored strength in this sector to try panzer units scraped together from battered formations. Fresh brigades rushed in, veterans mixed with new crews, all of it driven by one idea: hit Patton where his speed made him vulnerable. Patton's Third Army had been moving like a blade, but even a blade can snap if you strike it at the right point. The German plan was simple on paper: strike a thinly held American corridor, push through with armor, slice the roads behind the spearheads, then let confusion do what bullets don't make the enemy back away. And for a few tense hours, it looked like it might work. Reports began to arrive in the American command posts like raindrops before a storm. German armor sighted, American outposts driven in, a road junction threatened. A fuel column forced off the road, enemy artillery walking across fields where minutes earlier American infantry had been moving with their heads up. It wasn't panic yet, but it was the kind of news that makes men stop talking mid-sentence, the kind that makes a staff officer glance at a commander and try to read his face. Somewhere behind the front, radios crackled, couriers ran, maps were spread across hoods of vehicles. Pins were moved with tense fingers, and then the messages reached Patton's headquarters. The officers around him expected what they'd seen from other generals. They expected caution, maybe even irritation. This was the sort of situation where a careful commander stabilizes the line. He reinforces the point of impact. He digs in. He gathers strength. He waits. Patton listened. He asked a few questions, short, direct ones. Where exactly? How many? What roads? What's moving and what's stuck? Then he did something that always unsettled people who worked around him. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He looked interested. Because to Patton, a German counterattack wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. It meant the enemy was finally coming out of cover, finally showing his hand, finally presenting something Patton could hit. And Patton did not waste targets. He leaned over the map and traced the likely German approach with one finger. Then he tapped another spot, the place the Germans thought was safe, the place behind their thrust, the place they were assuming the Americans would never reach in time. He didn't say hold. He didn't say retreat. He said, in his quiet, almost casual way, the words that changed the next 24 hours. Fine. We'll ruin them. The first step was speed, but not reckless speed. Patton's kind of speed. The kind that comes from already knowing what you want to do before the enemy finishes what he's doing. He ordered mobile units to shift immediately, not tomorrow, not after a conference. Now, armor that had been pointed east was turned, then flung sideways like a door, slammed shut in the German face. Recon elements were pushed forward to find the edges of the attack, not the center. Patton didn't want to meet the punch head-on. He wanted to grab the attacker's wrist and twist. He called for artillery to register on likely choke points, roads, bridges, small villages, any place where tanks had to funnel through. He didn't talk about stopping the German armor. He talked about bleeding it, because tanks don't die from bravery. They die when they're forced to slow down, when they're forced into narrow roads, when they're forced into predictable movement. That's when artillery finds them. That's when aircraft find them. That's when the panic begins. Patton's staff began firing off orders across the network like sparks from a grinder. Units shifted. Batteries repositioned. Engineers were told which crossings to hold. and which to prepare to destroy. Recon was told to stop reporting what they saw and start predicting what the enemy would do next. That was the second step, prediction. Patton had spent years studying armored warfare. He understood something the Germans had once mastered and were now struggling to maintain: tempo is everything. If you can make the enemy react to you, you're already winning. So Patton decided the Germans would not set the tempo. Not even for an hour. He treated the counterattack like a door that had been opened. If you let it remain open, more danger comes through. If you slam it shut fast enough, you trap whatever came through inside the room with you. The Germans were driving forward, confident that American lines were thin. They were expecting to find weakness and exploit it. What they did not expect was to meet an American response that didn't behave like a defense at all. Patton's third step was deception, not theatrical deception, but battlefield deception. He ordered movements designed to be seen. Dust columns on one road while the real punch moved on another. Radio chatter deliberately increased in certain sectors, while silence fell over the units preparing the real strike. To the Germans, it began to feel like the Americans had more forces than they actually did. And that is when doubt crept into the German commanders' minds. Not full doubt, just enough. The kind that makes a man hesitate for 10 minutes. In war, 10 minutes can be fatal. The fourth step was pressure, constant, layered, relentless pressure. As German armor pushed forward, American artillery began to land not simply on the front line but behind it. Not random shells, but methodical fire onto the roads that fed the attack. Supply vehicles started burning. Infantry units found their communications interrupted. A German commander can fight without sleep. He can fight without comfort. He cannot fight without fuel and ammunition. Patton's guns were not just killing tanks. They were killing momentum. And Patton, as always, insisted on knowing exactly what was happening at the front, not in vague terms, but in moving, living detail. He demanded updates frequently. If a report sounded slow, he asked why. If an officer said we can't, Patton asked how quickly can't could be turned into can. At one point, when a staff officer suggested the Germans might be attempting to draw Americans into a trap, Patton's eyes narrowed with something like amusement. A trap? He said, as if tasting the word. Good. Then they're staying in it. That's the mental shift that broke the counterattack. Patton refused to treat it as a threat. He treated it as an opening. By mid-morning, the German thrust had reached its most dangerous point. American units in the sector were under real pressure. There were moments when individual platoons faced enemy armor at uncomfortable distances. Moments when an American driver looked down a road and saw German vehicles where they weren't supposed to be. But while those local fights raged, Patton's larger machine was already moving into place. The fifth step was to strike the flanks. A counterattack is strongest at the tip and weakest at the sides. The Germans were pushing forward like a spear. Patton aimed for the shaft, not the point. American armored groups moved in arcs, cutting across fields and back roads, appearing at crossroads that German officers had marked as safe. Suddenly, German units found themselves receiving fire from directions their maps didn't warn them about. A supply truck turned a corner and drove straight into an American roadblock. A German staff car tried to retreat and found the road already under artillery fire. Now the German commander's nightmare begins. Because once the sides are threatened, the spear has a choice: keep pushing forward and risk being cut off, or turn sideways to protect itself and lose momentum. Either choice kills the attack. Patton knew that, and he made sure the Germans felt it. The sixth step was to weaponize the sky. In September 1944, weather could be a cruel dictator. Fog and low clouds sometimes kept aircraft grounded. When the sky stayed closed, tanks could move with more freedom. When it opened, they became targets. Patton didn't wait for the perfect forecast. He prepared as if the sky would open at any moment. He coordinated air support so that when visibility improved even briefly, American aircraft could strike immediately. He wanted the Germans to feel hunted. even before they could see the hunters. And when the weather broke, it was like a curtain pulled back from a stage. American fighter bombers began to appear, fast and low, searching roads and fields for movement. German tanks that had been confident under fog now tried to hide among hedgerows and trees. But tanks are not silent, and they are not invisible. From the air, a moving armored column is like a vein of dark metal in a pale countryside. The strikes didn't have to destroy everything. They had to force the Germans to slow, to scatter, to stop and hide. When an attacking force starts hiding, it is no longer attacking. And that is the moment you can break it. Patton's seventh step was ruthless coordination. This is the part most people don't understand about speed. They imagine a general screaming orders and units racing blindly forward. That's not Patton's kind of speed. Patton's speed came from coordination, making artillery, armor, infantry, engineers, and aircraft behave like a single body. While German commanders struggled to coordinate their counterattack under pressure, Patton's units moved with an almost mechanical rhythm. Artillery struck choke points. Armor moved to cut roads. Infantry cleaned up pockets. Loud, aggressive patrols pushed the Germans, keeping them awake, keeping them uneasy, forcing them to believe American numbers were bigger than they were. And through it all, Patton's headquarters continued to pour out one message: do not pause. A counterattack survives if you let it breathe. Patton refused to let it breathe. By afternoon, the German thrust was no longer clean. It was messy. Units were out of position. Communications were strained. Tank crews were tired. Infantry were unsure where their neighboring units were. German officers began sending reports up the chain: fuel short, resistance heavier than expected, American armor appearing on the flank, airstrikes increasing. A German commander who had started the day imagining a controlled advance now found himself imagining something else: escape routes. And Patton, sensing that shift, moved to the eighth step: close the exits. He ordered blocking forces placed on key roads. He directed artillery not just to fire where Germans were, but where Germans would want to go when they started running. This is how routes are created. Not by winning a firefight, but by destroying the enemy's belief that retreat is possible. When soldiers believe retreat is possible, they can fight and fall back in order. When they believe retreat is not possible, they break. Patton's units began capturing small groups of German soldiers who looked less like fighters and more like men who had lost the thread. Their uniforms were dirty, their faces tight. They asked the same questions in broken English or through interpreters: how many Americans are there? Where are we? Are the roads cut? That question: are the roads cut? Is the sound of an army beginning to crack. Patton's ninth step was psychological pressure. He understood human beings, he understood pride, he understood fear. German commanders had launched this counterattack partly because they believed the Americans would respond cautiously. They believed American generals were predictable. They believed Patton might be reckless but still manageable. Now they were being forced to confront a new reality. Patton was not reacting. He was dictating. He was forcing them to fight while moving, forcing them to coordinate while under air attack, forcing them to make decisions while their fuel was burning behind them. This is what breaks armies, not one big explosion, but the stacking of problems until the brain can't keep up. By evening, the German attack had reached its turning point. In some places it still fought, in others it hesitated. But the overall shape had changed. It was no longer a spear thrust forward. It was a pocket bulging, vulnerable, and growing more isolated by the hour. Patton saw it, and he made the 10th step his final one: turn the counterattack into a trap. He ordered a coordinated push from multiple directions, not a reckless charge, but a tightening. Armor pressed in. Infantry advanced carefully. Artillery fired in planned patterns. Engineers cleared obstacles and secured crossings, and the air, whenever the weather allowed, kept striking movement. The Germans tried to respond. They attempted to regroup. They tried to punch outward. They tried to re-establish a line. But now they were fighting not for advantage but for survival. And in that shift, when an attacking force becomes a force trying to survive, something irreversible happens. The initiative dies. The moment initiative dies, morale starts bleeding out. Some German units began withdrawing without orders, simply because their officers could feel the danger growing around them. Others stayed too long, trusting that someone above them had a plan. They waited for orders that never arrived. They waited for fuel that couldn't get through. They waited for support that was already being hit by artillery. And then, in the dark, the American pressure continued. Patton was famous for demanding movement even at night. He didn't believe in giving the enemy time to recover. German soldiers who had survived the day now had to survive the night listening to engines in the distance, hearing artillery shift, watching flares drift down like pale suns over the fields. Night in war doesn't always bring rest. Sometimes it brings dread. By dawn, the German counterattack was no longer coherent. American units found abandoned vehicles on roads, fuel trucks left with engines cold, artillery pieces deserted. In some sectors, Germans fought hard, but they were fighting like isolated men, not like a coordinated force. In other sectors, German soldiers surrendered quickly, exhausted and unsure. American commanders on the ground began reporting something Patton always wanted to hear: they're pulling back. But Patton did not treat pulling back as an end, he treated it as a beginning. Because a retreat can be orderly, or it can be a rout. And Patton wanted a rout. He increased pressure. He pushed faster. He ordered flanking movements to stay ahead of the retreat. He used artillery to hammer the roads the Germans were trying to use. The retreat began to speed up. That's another key moment. A retreat that speeds up is a retreat that is losing control. German officers tried to restore it. They tried to impose order. They tried to form rear guards. They tried to establish new defensive lines. But Patton's style of pursuit is what made those attempts fail. He didn't chase like a man chasing a runner. He chased like a man closing a door. He aimed not at where the Germans were, but where they needed to go. He kept hitting the junctions, the bridges, the narrow roads where vehicles had no room to maneuver. Each hit caused a delay. Each delay caused a jam. Each jam caused panic. Soon, German columns began to resemble traffic accidents more than formations. Vehicles stuck, tanks unable to turn, trucks burning, soldiers moving on foot, trying to escape the road because the road was being shelled. And somewhere in that chaos, a German commander finally understood the full horror of what had happened. They had attacked Patton to slow him. Instead, they had given him the exact kind of battle he wanted. They had stepped into his rhythm. They had exposed their movement. They had turned themselves into a moving target. Patton had taken their counterattack and turned it into a trap, then turned the trap into a slaughter of momentum. This is the part that needs to be said plainly. Patton didn't win this moment because he had more men. He didn't win because he had better tanks. He won because he used the enemy's decision against them. A counterattack creates a bulge. Patton cut around it. A counterattack relies on supply. Patton targeted the roads behind it. A counterattack relies on tempo. Patton broke the tempo and replaced it with his own. A counterattack relied on morale. Patton stacked pressure until morale cracked. That is how a counterattack becomes a rout. By the end of the engagement, the Germans had lost far more than equipment. They had lost confidence, and confidence is the fuel of every plan. Later, German accounts from the period describe the Americans under Patton in words that sound almost like frustration mixed with fear. They described an enemy that moved too fast, struck too hard, and refused to behave predictably. They described units appearing unexpectedly, artillery fire that felt intelligently directed, airstrikes that seemed to arrive precisely when needed. They weren't describing magic. They were describing a commander who understood momentum like a weapon. Patton himself, when told the counterattack had been smashed and the enemy was withdrawing in disorder, did not celebrate like a man surprised by victory. He did not act as if he'd pulled off a miracle. He acted as if the outcome was inevitable, because in his mind it was. To Patton, there were two kinds of enemy behavior: an enemy who surrendered and an enemy who needed to be broken. The Germans had chosen the second, and Patton broke them. but there's a human dimension here that maps don't show. Imagine the German tank commander who began the counterattack, believing his unit might restore the front, maybe even earn a mention in a report. Imagine the confidence of starting an operation with a clear plan, with orders that make sense, with the feeling that the enemy is finally off balance. And then imagine that same commander, hours later, hearing artillery land behind him, realizing the supply road is under fire, hearing the scream of aircraft overhead, being told American tanks have appeared on his flank, and suddenly realizing the plan is gone. Not revised, not delayed, gone. Now he's not thinking about victory, he's thinking about getting his crew home alive. That shift from planning to surviving is where Routs are born. Patton didn't merely defeat German armor, he defeated German certainty. He made them feel hunted. He made them feel surrounded even when they weren't. He made them feel that every road was watched, every movement punished, every hesitation fatal. And once an army starts to feel that way, the collapse becomes only a matter of time. There's a reason Patton's opponents feared him. It wasn't just his aggression. Lots of commanders were aggressive. It was that he made aggression systematic. He turned his response into a sequence one that didn't depend on luck, didn't depend on perfect weather, didn't depend on the enemy making a mistake. It depended on one thing, Patton refusing to surrender the initiative. That's the lesson behind the story. A counterattack is supposed to seize initiative. Patton seized it back, step by step, and then used it to crush the counterattack until it stopped being an operation and became a retreat, and then stopped being a retreat and became a rout. And when the dust settled, the American advance resumed. Road junctions reopened, supply lines moved forward, fuel began to flow again. Units repositioned, not as a broken force recovering, but as a force continuing its push. To the Germans, the message was terrifyingly clear. If you counterattack Patton, you didn't slow him down. You simply gave him a target that moved. And Patton loved targets that moved, because moving targets have somewhere they need to go. And if you can predict where a target needs to go, you can close the door before it gets there. So if you were sitting in that German headquarters in September 1944, watching reports come in first confident, then confused, then desperate, what would you have done? Would you have called it off sooner? Would you have pushed harder? Would you have tried to break out before the roads were cut? Or would you have done what so many commanders did when faced with Patton's pressure? Waited 1 hour too long, hoping the situation would stabilize until the only option left was to run. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, moments where decisions, speed, and psychology mattered more than numbers, subscribe now. Because history isn't just dates and maps. Sometimes it's a single choice, and sometimes it's a man like Patton taking the enemy's boldest move and turning it into their worst day.